How's it going, everybody? My name is Dan Longton, and welcome to LongtinArt. Today we're going to be talking about surface preparation, no matter what type of surface you're going to be working on in painting. There's a couple of things that I recommend that you take action to, and just to help prepare the surface a little better. Now, there are tons of options you can buy out there to paint on. There's pre-made panels in a varying amount of thickness, 3/4 inch. I've seen them in a 1/2 inch. I've even seen them in cubes that they're like 3-5 inches thick. There are pre-stretched canvases that are gessoed. There are roll canvases that are raw. There are roll canvases that are gessoed. There's linen. Doesn't matter what you buy. It's all about the same thing, and you do need to take a few steps to better ensure you have a good surface to work on. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about is pre-stretched canvas panels. Okay, basically what this is, it's a piece of chipboard, thick chipboard. It's like a better cardboard. It's really just compressed. And what they do is they take a piece of canvas and wrap it over. They cut it. They glue it down with PVA glue, and then add a backing to it. I think I got this from Dick Blick. I did. There is Dick Blick. And then they basically spray it with gesso. They're probably pre-gessoed panel canvases before they glue it down, but just so they don't have to do it after it's all together. But these are pretty good things, but you do have to prepare these a little bit further afterwards. You could build your own panel, hard surface. This is MDF. It's actually S2S, meaning smooth on two sides. If you do choose to take the route of MDF panel, which is a wonderful surface to paint on, I love working with these panels. You just want to make sure it's S2S, because if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, your typical hardware store, what you're going to find is they usually don't have the S2S. It's usually S1S, smooth on one side. And then it has that kind of like kind of soft, kind of furry type background. You don't want that because it absorbs moisture tremendously, and you really don't want this thing to fluctuate. And what it is, it's basically hot pressed. That's what makes it smooth on two sides. It's almost like thinking about, paper. You can get hot press or cold press paper. Cold press has a little bit more of a tooth, whereas hot press has a smooth surface, almost like illustration board. And what it basically is they press this with immense amounts of pressure, except they press it hot, like an iron. And the easiest way to remember it is that when you hot press your shirt, it gets rid of the wrinkles, and therefore there's no texture. So hot press is going to be smooth, and cold press and paper is going to have a tooth so it can grab onto charcoal and whatnot. But back to the panel. S2S, it's MDF. I get it from a local hardwood place here in Houston in downtown. Great stuff, cheap, and you can cut it to any size. This is a 7x7 panel right here that I have pre-gessoed in the video, which I'm about to show you. Regardless of what you buy, whether it's pre-gessoed or it's raw, you really want to prepare your surface yourself with some gesso. Now, gesso can be bought at your local art supply store. Like here we have Jerry's Artorama, Texas Art Supply, or you can order it online through Dick Blick, Jerry's Artorama, even Amazon. Typically, these are connected through third parties. Even on Amazon, it's usually Dick Blick or Jerry's Artorama, depending upon who you buy. You can even pick some of the gessos up at Hobby Lobby or Michael's. These are more craft stores as opposed to art stores. They're more craft oriented. But if you really want the good stuff, I've been using Dick Blick's gesso for a while now. It's a little bit on the thinner side as opposed to like Utrecht. Theirs is really like a paste. It works good for canvases if you really want to get rid of the texture of the canvas and make it smooth. Even on stretched canvas, it can become very smooth as long as you just put a couple of layers down. But today, I'm going to talk about a few things. When you do prepare the surface, you do have to sand the panel first. And that's really what I'm going to show you here real quick. So regardless of what material you're going to be using, for this demonstration, I'm going to be doing a couple of different variances of MDF, S2S right there. Regardless of what surface, if it's going to be birch, if it's a hardwood panel that's raw and it doesn't have any gesso on it, you need to sand it. And I'm going to be using a 220 grit sander here. It's an orbital sander with a varying speed. But you just want to give it some grit because that smooth surface, it doesn't have any tooth for the gesso to bite down to and really grab on and ensure that you have proper adhesion of the gesso layer to the panel. So I'm just basically going once over with the 220, getting rid of anything. This panel's a little bit big, so I'm actually going to cut it in half. I wanted to cut it down to like an 8 by 10, and I had a big board, so I'm just going to get 2 of them, and then I'm just going to equal them out, make them all the same size. So yeah, I'm just preparing it. But no matter what panel size you're working with, or if it's a hardwood like birch or a panel of like MDF, you really want to just make sure that you're sanding it down. So I've got 2 types of gesso here. One is a Liquitex that I'm going to be using for spray, and then the Dick Blick I usually use for like rolling it down or even spraying a texture down first on the canvas. So I'm going to be using a spray gun in this video, but you absolutely can do this at home. You don't have to have a compressor or anything. I'm just showing you there that there's a defect in the board there. You always want to make sure and give it a once over before you start gessoing, because these things will be amplified once you start putting gesso down. So it just make sure the surface is smooth when you start doing this down. And then I'm just making sure it's square. A good trick is just measuring from corner to corner. So if you're doing this at home and you don't have like a compressor, you can do it multiple different ways. One obviously is just with a paintbrush, but I'm going to show you a quick trick here in a minute about the rollers. This is a cabinet and door foam. It has a very, very low nap, and you can see that in that foam brush that it's relatively smooth. This is going to ensure that the surface that comes out is going to be smooth, and you just basically have to, put a coat down. I usually put the first one down thin, let it dry, come back and go a different direction, just so that you ensure that you're covering the whole thing. The other option, if you don't want to use a roller, is to use a brush, and you can roll it down. Again, I like using thin coats just so it builds it up, slowly, as opposed to doing one thick coat. It's always better to, put multiple coats down of thin coats rather than one thick coat. But then the third option, which is really going to give you the smoothest coat, is a foam brush. One, because it doesn't add bubbles like a roller would do, due to the low nap of the texture. You're actually pulling it across rather than rolling it down. But regardless of which way you do it, you just want to make sure you do multiple coats and you don't see any of that surface. So here I'm going to actually start preparing my canvases, my panels here, for spraying. And I like to add a little bit of a texture to mine. So I'm actually going to be thinning out my Dick Blick gesso, just because it's a little too thick to spray in my gun there. You can see that purple gun. I'm going to cover all of the details of the brush here in just a few minutes, but for the most part, I usually, now this varies on manufacturers if you're not using Dick Blick. Sometimes they're a little thicker and thin, so this is by no means a one-way ticket to get it right. You just have to mess with the dilution of it, and I think for this batch I did a 3 parts to 1 gesso, 3 parts gesso to 1 part water, and then I just gave it a good shake. Just so that it's all mixed up. And like I said, depending on the brand and thickness, your ratios will vary. Mainly, I'm just trying to get it to spray, a good textured pattern, light texture. But the gun that I'm using is called an HVLP gravity-fed spray gun, and that usually stands for high volume, low pressure. But they're all pretty much built the same. This one's actually, the one I'm using is a really cheap one. They all usually have a cup at the top that you would pour whatever you're going to spray into. The spray nozzle at the top controls the direction of the fan, whether it's the fan pattern is vertical or horizontal. The fluid knob control in the back, that's what basically controls your needle. Then there's a pattern knob that you can switch from fan to more of a spray dot pattern. The trigger actually pulls the needle back, and it's a double action needle. I'll cover that here in just a second. And then you have your airflow control, which is the amount of pressure that comes through the gun. And then, of course, you have to hook it up to some sort of compressor at the air inlet down at the bottom. Now, I usually add a moisture trap to mine, which you can see back in that video or in the gun here. So basically the concept of a airbrush, any airbrush, if you can imagine, an Iwata, the little guns that you do detail work with, or even spray guns that you would spray a car with, which is what I'm using. Now, mine's not expensive. I bought it cheap. I think I got these two guns that you see in the video at, I think it was one of like those discount tool stores like Harbor Freight or something like that, I think is where I got it. But the idea is simple. Now, if you can imagine a funnel, okay, and I've got my funnel coming up, a needle goes into the bottom of the funnel, where it would be kind of like a funnel, the funnel, and then it would narrow down. if you stick a needle into that funnel, okay, this is essentially how an airbrush works, that if you can imagine the paint flowing, as you pull the needle back, it allows more and more paint to flow. So when you pull that trigger, it's called a double action, meaning when you first pull it, there's going to be a second resistance, meaning when you first pull that trigger, what's going to happen is it's just going to spray air because you're activating the air inlet and it's spraying pressurized air, okay? And then when you pull that second action in the trigger, that's what really starts to put pressure on the spring and the needle, and it pulls that needle back. So as you pull the trigger, what happens is it pulls the needle back, allowing more paint to flow. Okay, and then you can let off and it stops the flow of paint, but you can always keep the air going. And you'll see that when I'm spraying, it seems like I'm like spraying, but the air doesn't stop. And I let it. I basically do passes so that I start out here, spray, let it off, spray, let it off, spray, let it off. That way I'm not creating barbell effects. And what I mean by that is that if you're spraying from here to here and you're not overlapping your stroke past the canvas, what you'll end up with is these called barbell effects, where there's more paint here, or gesso in this case, on the ends of your spray pattern, and you end up with this kind of barbell effect with a heavier spray pattern on the ends, which is why you always want to cover the whole thing, and you kind of get in this psh, 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 psh kind of setup. But yeah, that's essentially how a airbrush in any kind of manner works, whether it's a gravity fed, if it's a siphon feed, if it's a side siphon feed. There's all sorts of kinds that you can get, whether the paint cups on the bottom, is it on the side, or is it on the top. I prefer the gravity feeds just because gravity pulls it down, and as you pull that needle back, gravity pulls the paint down and you spray it out that way. Just my preference though. So here I am, with my panels, and this is that spray texture, and I'm kind of experimenting here. I just wanted to give, it's not an atomized even spray, and you can kind of see that, and I'll pause it there. But essentially, I'm just trying to get a texture down first. And once I do that, I then switch back over to my Liquitex gesso, which is a little bit smoother consistency than the watered down version of the Dick Blick. So mainly the main point that I'm trying to make in this video is that when you put it down, it's better to, regardless of the method of application, when you put the gesso down, it's better to put it down in multiple layers that are thin as opposed to one thick one. If you get to that point where you're applying a very thick coat to the panel, what happens is if that first layer is thick, let's say it's your first one, you apply that first layer and it's thick, and it's dry to the touch, but it's not quite dry all the way through. What ends up happening when you put on that second coat is that you can't really see where you've applied it and you haven't applied it as easily as in that first layer. So when you lay down a thick layer of gesso and you put down a thin layer over that next one, or even a thick layer, what happens is you end up with these pockets of wet. And what ends up happening, if the top layer dries faster than the bottom expands a little bit and it starts to crack that top layer. And then you end up with these weird little crevices in your canvas, which you don't really want. You want to avoid that. So regardless of the application, whether it's brush, roll, or even foam brush, or even spray, the key is to apply, lightly sand by hand in between coats, and then reapply, apply, sand, apply, sand, apply, sand. And then when you get to that last coat, sand it. I've even heard of some people wet sanding it to get it really, really smooth. I prefer a little bit of tooth, but that's just my preference. But that's it, guys. For preparing your surfaces, I always recommend that you put a little bit of your own gesso down, even on those pre-primed canvas or panels. But that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. Again, I'm Dan Longton, and this is LongtinArt and how to prepare your panels. So have a good one.